So now we can open it up to discussion. I'm sure there are lots of questions. If anyone wants to start us off. Yeah, in the back.
Maria, thanks for the great talk. Just two quick comments.
You speak up a bit, please.
Okay. First, when you mentioned the first wave of gentrifying the industrial city, it resonated a lot with the more recent waves of gentrifying.
I didn't mention gentrifying.
Not gentrifying, but concretizing and conquering the environment.
Nature, conquering nature. But it had nothing to do with gender.
No, but it resonated with a lot of the conquering of evil spaces within urban centers today.
Yeah.
And those of us working on urban transformation usually analyze it hand in hand with also opening up spaces for capital accumulation. So I was wondering if there's that dimension figuring in, like in 19th century, it also opens up spaces for capital accumulation. And secondly, in terms of this gated communities and othering and closing down of space and othering of environment, I think there is also the othering and kind of leaving out of different types of collective social arrangements that you leave out, and also you see that it's trying to be mimicked within these gated communities. For instance, in Turkey, in this big shopping mall, there is this terrace called the neighborhood, where they mimic, but it's completely commodified, and it's a very certain particular representation of the neighborhood, which is completely directed to consumption. So, and I think that leaving out of social relations and collective forms of space, or collective forms of occupying space and living, it has repercussions on our imaginaries and our praxis. So I think that has a kind of a halting effect on the production of utopias as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very excellent, very good questions. Thank you for those. The first one, yes, I didn't have time to go through it. I've written a lot, and others have too, about how all these urban transformations, the 19th century, early 20th century, the putting down of technology networks, the embankment of rivers, the disappearance of rivers underground, the Clean Air Acts, etc., were going hand in glove with massive displacement of at the time working or even migrant communities. Examples: the embankment of the Thames River, but also the moving underground rivers in Athens, for example, were going hard. Not the only rationale behind it, but definitely one of the rationales behind it, and definitely one of the outcomes was that the displacement of all the communities that had set homes along the banks of rivers, because illegal settlements along the banks of rivers were the obvious way for people to house themselves, because they had straight access to water, or they couldn't drink it in the case of London, but they could just discharge their sewage, etc. So yes, our Central Park in New York, of course, one of the main drives for producing Central Park was, but where now Central Park stands, used to be the Seneca Village, which was an African-American settlement, was the first ever African-American settlement to get land rights in the US. So as soon as they got land rights, they were displaced in the name of bringing nature into the city. So yes,
Maybe I can get a few references from you afterwards.
Sorry?
Maybe I can get a few references from you afterwards.
Great, yeah, there's plenty of, so please do, yeah. And the opening, yes, the othering through utopia, yes, definitely, there is an othering process involved in many. That's why I think that's why I say that any utopian vision, once it is materialized, it is bound to fail. And that's why I insist not on this big success, but on failing better. Because the moment you materialize any idea, it's an act of exclusion. Any act of producing space is an act of exclusion. And so the key is to think hard who you want to exclude, who you want to include. And any utopia, at the moment everything is in the idea of the imaginary, and the sphere of ideas and imaginary, it's open. But the moment you start materializing, you're an architect too, or a planner?
No, I'm an economist.
You're an economist, okay, but I come from background in architecture and planning, so any architect or planner knows that the moment you need to, you take pencil and paper and you start drafting, any line you produce on the paper is a line of exclusion. And any line you produce on the paper is actually closing down the imaginary. David Harvey, in his Spaces of Hope, in the last chapter, talks about how these ideas, talks about Spaces of Hope, and he was running with them in conferences, and then he was invited in a number of architectural schools. And then, of course, that's what architects do. That's what they did with me. They produce plans out of these ideas. And he was stupefied. How is it possible that these opening up ideas, opening up the world, could be so closing down and so exclusionary when they become? But that's what it is. So that's why I say fail better, because but in the process of failing better, we change the world.
Thanks.
Sorry,
And I
it
think
was
we
a
had
long answer.
another question from Marty. Did you have your hand up? No? Who else had it? Yeah, you did. Yeah?
Yeah, just trying to challenge the idea that actually the Utopian project is kind of born in the mid-19th century. Because I think actually the utopian ideas were developed way before that.
Mm-hmm.
Only the mid-19th century marks the turning point because technological advances actually made it possible to tackle all those ideas that before we just think of it. So I really think that it was with humanism, the whole discussion of the city as a vice, the city as a issues, place, and a reformulation of the relationship with nature took place. And the whole, you're very right when you say that there's a correspondence between the idea of conquering nature and then reproducing nature in a domesticized way. Yeah. And that's the whole point of the American experiment, which actually is a huge advance in terms of planning and architecture. The point being, the whole, this idea of nature as something that you conquer and extract resources from, develop at the same time as the utopian ideal.
Yes.
So, and for example, Ebenezer Forward, Garden City, was criticized at its very birth for being actually a cover for a speculative, business-oriented development. Yeah. So, I mean, to what extent utopia is not a construction of this capitalistic logic and bourgeois like way of acting? And if so, if it would be, how can we trust utopian thinking?
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. Yeah, of course it is utopia. Any utopia produced within capitalism is, by definition, is living, breathing, the capitalist imaginary institution of the capitalist society. It is capitalist, no doubt. And yes, particularly Howard's that you mentioned, it is a reformist. Yes, that's why there's this distinction between reformist utopias and radical utopias. So Howard's utopia was a reformist. It was time to reform, to produce a better capitalism. Never claimed it wasn't. Yeah, industrial paternalism was trying to produce a better capitalism. Robert Moses was trying to produce better capitalism. And a better capitalism is never a better capitalism for all. It includes, uneven, as we all know, uneven development is at the heart of that. So it produces better for some, and with the ideology of the trickle-down effect embedded in the process. And that's why Howard's ideas actually found a very concrete spatial expressions. The whole of the program of new towns in the UK, around 30 new towns were built after the Second World War, precisely based on these principles. And yes, they were speculative, a whole lot. And some of the things I mentioned, like the archigram or even the futurist plans, were not materialized, precisely because their ideas were reimagining the whole edifice of society, unlike Howard. So they were more radical rather than transformative or reformist. That's why I didn't want to make it too complex. But I don't actually like utopia as a word. I have problems with utopia precisely for that. So I much prefer to talk about imaginaries or new imaginaries. But the fact that all these utopias produced within a capitalist system are almost by definition capitalist doesn't mean that the possibility for a new radical change is not possible. But we've seen very few and radical is not necessarily what we would like to see as radical. That's another important thing to bear in mind.
Well, radical was under the very formulation of modernistic.
Yes, but I mean, a new radical imaginary. So, for example, the conception and material implementation of slavery was a radical imaginary. Huh? It's not radical of how we would like to construe radical, but it radically changed social, environmental, social relations. Communism obviously was a radical imaginary, still is. Yeah. So that's why utopia is not necessary. But perhaps we can have a broader discussion because it's a big discussion, and I wanted to keep it a bit simple for the presentation. Yeah. But thank you. It's good.
Emily?
One part where I didn't quite follow your reasoning was when you talked about contemporary modernism or contemporary forms of securitizing, purifying and sterilizing living environments, and how this differed from the sort of concretizing of urban spaces during the collective modernist projects earlier on. That was the first question. And something that came to mind when you talked about contemporary utopia are these floating cities. These I don't know if you've heard of those very strange new projects that people want to build, basically new cities from the start up somewhere in the ocean.
Yeah. I think there is one that exists,
but I've seen it twice.
It's like a huge ocean liner that. I think they've built one. Yeah.
So I was wondering if that figured at all in your and if you had any take on this.
Yeah. So for the first question, what I identified as a significant difference between these earlier ideas and thoughts and contemporary ones is the scale, to put it simply, in which they envision the transformation. So for contemporary, the images I showed about commodified, controlled nature, it addresses the human beings' environment relations at the individual level, at the level of the individual home and individual dwelling. It's about being sustainable in your own personal behavior, in your own personal habitat, as it were. And by the earlier ideas that I mentioned, this change of personal behavior and change of personal habitat was seen only as a side effect or a small part of a broader socio-environmental transformation that would take place at the scale of a nation or even the whole world. So does that make sense?
Yes, but then in the sense that the way of transforming nature is very similar or the same in a way. I mean, I don't.
The ideas about so the depiction of nature as both evil or the types of nature we need to exclude and the ones so these prevail, and that's why this whole antithesis between city and nature, different depictions of city prevail. Yes, but it is the ideas, the imaginaries of how we're going to address this relationship that's changed from collective dreams for a collective social environmental transformation to individualized, atomized lifestyles. That's the argument I made.
Yeah, we have time for one final question.
Okay.
If you go.
Okay, thank you. Congratulations, I really love your work, and I use your work a lot. One thing, when you started to talk about nature, I can feel like the division between nature and human. I don't know why, because basically when you were talking about the bricks, the lights, how water, how the land had to be mobilized, I think that probably is good to integrate the human nature here, like the necessity to be together in one place. I think the archaeology of landscape there is really important, how to show that there is a human necessity to be together for the last 12,000 years. So the city is an evolution of different kinds of settlements and different cultural ecology. And in that sense, I think could be good for us to try to think about how is the production of this second nature, to try to understand how the production of nature is different in other contexts. For example, in the case of Latin America, in the case of my country, the city is an invention of the colonization process. That's the official discourse. But we know that, for example, the Incas had cities in Chile too, but we don't know nothing about those cities because we belong to a different mode of production. So basically, my invitation for us, like for political ecologists, is to try to understand this process of the second nature, but the production of the second nature, in order to use a similar framework, but try to understand different contexts.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree with you. And I did insert human beings. I talked a lot about labor, so I inserted human beings in the process by using the word labor, of course. In the production of nature, nothing would be produced without labor. And by labor, it's not just manual labor, right? It's intellectual labor, it's the production of ideas, of theories, it's affective labor, it's how we engage with each other and all. Yeah, so.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think we had some